The night Rael Corvin came back from the woods, he didn't speak for 11 days. His mother found him at the edge of their property, in the gray hour before dawn, standing in the frost-killed grass with his boots on the wrong feet, staring at the tree line like he expected it to move. She thought he'd been drinking. Then she saw his hands, the burns that went deep, deeper than any fire she'd known, and the strange symmetrical marks along the inside of his forearms that the doctors would later call abrasions of unknown origin and photograph extensively and never explain. Rael was 16. His 4 friends had been out there with him. 3 of them walked back out. Jonah Marsh didn't. The 11 days of silence were not voluntary. He had things he wanted to say. Things pressing against the inside of his chest like water behind a dam. But every time he opened his mouth, the words arrived in the wrong order. In a sequence, his brain kept scrambling before it reached his tongue. He would sit at the kitchen table while his mother moved carefully around him, and he would think. We were taken. We were examined. Something opened Jonah up and took him apart, and put most of him back wrong, and he died in the grass while the ship was still moving away. Think all of that very clearly, and then open his mouth and hear himself say, I need to call school. I missed some classes. I think I have a test. The doctors said it was shock. They said trauma. They said a number of things that were almost true in the way that descriptions of colors are almost true when you're explaining them to someone who's never seen. He'd been out of Calvert by 18. College, then work, then the gradual construction of a life built around the radio on the kitchen counter and the blackout curtains and the particular arrangement of a person who knows something is coming and has decided to be ready for it when it arrives. Not to stop it, just to not be caught unprepared again. That was 15 years ago. Now Rael lived alone in a converted farmhouse off a logging road 7 miles, outside of Calvert, Montana, with blackout curtains on every window and a backup generator wired to flood every outbuilding with light at a single switch. He worked remotely, software architecture for a firm that never asked him to come in. He had a woman named Sarah, who stayed 3 nights a week and had learned, without being told explicitly, not to ask about the scars on his forearms, or why he kept a battery-powered radio on the kitchen counter, tuned to a specific dead frequency. She was patient, in the way that people who love damaged things learn to be patient. She kept her own life. She didn't crowd him. He had not told her that the radio sometimes stopped being static. He had not told her what it meant when it did. He had been trying till something like peace for 15 years, brick by careful brick, and it had mostly held. Until the night Marcus Dole showed up at his door, with blood on his shirt, and something wrapped in a tarp in the bed of his pickup. Marcus was one of the 3 who'd walked out. So were Fenn and Cole, standing behind him in the driveway. Cole, with a length of chain in his hands, and Fenn with his jaw, set the way it always was when he'd already made a decision and knew someone was going. Argue with it. They were thicker now, older, faces carved by years of something that didn't have a good name. Rael would have known them anywhere. The dead look behind the eyes, the way none of them stood with their backs to the tree line. We got one, said. Rael looked at the tarp. Something shifted beneath it, slow and deliberate, like a tide. No, Rael said. Rael, no. He stepped back and tried to close the door. Fenn's boot was already across the threshold. It's been 15 years, Cole said. 15 years. Tch. Jonah's dead, Rael said. Killing that thing won't change it. We're not killing it, Marcus said. We're making it hurt first. Rael stood there in the wedge of warm light from his hallway and looked at his 3 oldest friends and the tarp wrap thing that had killed his. Sleep every night for 15 years, and he understood with the sick clarity of a man who knows how a story ends that the door was already closed. Behind him. Not the one in front of him, the metaphorical one. The one you walked through when you were 16 and stupid and went into the woods on a dare and came back with 3 companions less than you'd left with. He let them in. They moved it to the equipment barn, which was the most reinforced outbuilding on the property. Poured concrete floor, steel-framed walls, a single door with 3 deadbolts. Cole ran the chains through the tie-down anchors in the floor, while the thing inside the tarp made sounds that weren't quite sounds, vibrations that Rael felt in his back teeth and behind his eyes. He knew what those vibrations were. He'd been feeling faint echoes of them for 15 years, like a tuning fork struck in another room. When they pulled the tarp away, it looked worse than he remembered. That was the wrong word. Worse. It looked more real, more present, fundamentally alien in a way that no amount of mental preparation had ever managed to blunt. It was bipedal but wrong about it, its joints bending in one extra direction. Its proportions suggesting a skeleton that had been designed by something that understood vertebrates only, from a description. Its skin was the color of old pewter and moved slightly even when it was still. A slow, subcutaneous shift that made it look like the surface of cooled lava. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were clusters of wet amber at the front of a face that was otherwise featureless, no nose, no mouth that Rael could identify. A smooth expanse of pewter gray skin interrupted only by those amber nodes, and a series of vertical ridges along the jaw that pulsed faintly with some internal rhythm. It was chained at the wrists and ankles, its arms forced behind it, and it still managed to project the precise quality of something that was not afraid. "Bigger than I remembered," Fenn said. "You were 16, Cole said. "Everything was bigger." "Not everything." Marcus crouched down to the creature's level, his face perhaps 18 inches from those amber clusters. "Looking at it the way you look at something you've hated, for so long the hatred turned into a kind of intimacy. Hey, you remember me?" The creature's ridges pulsed. It said nothing. If it had a language, none of them had ever heard it. Rael stayed near the door with his arms crossed. "You didn't think this through," he said. "What's your plan, exactly? Torture it. The others come. You kill it. The others come faster and harder. You've handed yourself a situation with no good exits." "Our lives have been a situation with no good exits since we were 16, Fenn said. "And there was nothing to argue with in that." "There are others coming regardless," Marcus said. He turned from the creature. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I've been watching them, following the signs the way you taught us, before you quit. They've been getting more active in the last 3 months. More flyovers. More animals going missing from the Talbot farm. Whatever they've been building up to, we're close to it." Rael looked at him. "How close?" "Close enough that we stopped having choices about 2 weeks ago. We just didn't know it yet." In the corner of the barn, creature's ridges pulsed in a slow, patient rhythm. Rael watched it and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. The particular, carbonized certainty that the thing in front of him knew exactly how this was going to go, that it was waiting, that on some level he couldn't articulate. The last 15 years of his life had been exactly what it had been designed to look like. A pause. "Did anyone else know you were coming here?" he asked. Nobody answered, which was answer enough. Sarah came home from her shift at the veterinary clinic at 8:30, and 4 men in her kitchen who smelled like fear and pine resin, and a piece of her medical kit missing from the closet. She was 34 years old, and had spent 6 of those years doing rural large animal work, county, with no cell reception and 12 of them before. That growing up in a family that handled its problems quietly. She listened to what Rael told her with her jacket still on, and her keys in her hand, and when he finished she said, "How bad are the injuries?" Cole's hand, cut on the chain going in. "Fenn took a hit to the ribs, might be cracked. Anything else I should know?" He looked at her for a long moment. "The thing in the barn. It's a biological weapon, effectively. The bite carries a pathogen. If anyone's been bitten, I need to know now." A silence that lasted 1 second too long. Rael looked at Marcus. "It tagged me," Marcus said. "On the forearm. We got the chains on." Rael crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and grabbed Marcus's arm and pushed the sleeve back. The wound was 8 hours old, and already the edges were doing something wrong. A slight translucency. A web of dark lines spreading from the puncture site that had nothing to do with bruising. Rael had seen this before. He had seen it on Jonah Marsh, in the 3 hours between when the creatures finished with them and when the ship finally tilted away from the field and took the light with it, leaving them in the dark with a boy who was dying, and no way to understand how and no way to stop it. "Okay," Rael said. He let go of Marcus's arm. "Okay. It's bad?" Sarah asked quietly. "I don't know. Last time," he stopped. "Last time we didn't have the source." "You mean the creature?" "I mean it carries the cure as well as the pathogen." Has to, the abductions, they weren't random. They were running experiments. Contaminate and observe. Contaminate and observe. To run that experiment, you need a controlled variable. The thing that bites you needs to also be able to reverse the process. Otherwise, your sample pool degrades too fast. He was working it out as he said it. The pieces that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 15 years. Finally finding each other in the sequence. I always knew that. I never had the leverage. Now you do, Marcus said. Now I do. He went back to the barn. He stood outside the barn door for a moment first. The cold was thorough. Montana in October didn't negotiate. It informed you of conditions and expected you to adapt. He could see his breath in the spill of light from the farmhouse windows. And beyond that, the black mass of the pine tree line. And above that, the stars in their accustomed positions, doing their accustomed nothing. He'd spent a lot of nights looking at that tree line. Waiting. The waiting had always been the worst part. Not the certainty of something coming, but the open-ended uncertainty of when, of what shape it would take, of whether this time he'd be ready. He'd never been ready. He'd just been present, which turned out to be what mattered. The creature watched him approach with the same quality of patient waiting. Up close, the amber clusters had depth, layers of translucent tissue stacked in a way that scattered the light differently, at different angles. Like looking into something that went further back than physics should have allowed. Rail had a folding knife in his pocket and a flashlight in his hand, and a coil of industrial tubing that he'd pulled from the farm equipment cabinet. He set the tubing down on the workbench and pulled a stool over and sat down in front of the creature, close enough that he could hear the subcutaneous movement of its skin. Close enough that it could reach him if the chains hadn't been holding. Here's the thing, he said. You and I have something in common. The ridges pulsed. You left something in me 15 years ago. I don't know if it was intentional or if I was just collateral. But whatever it was, I can feel things I couldn't feel before. Your signals, the harmonics your ships put out. I picked up this frequency before I knew what it was, and spent 3 years thinking I was losing my mind. And then I found it on a dead radio band and figured out what I was actually hearing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that we can communicate. I'm not asking you to talk to me. I'm asking you to understand that I know more about what you are than you think I do. Nothing. The amber clusters caught the light and held it. A friend is dying, Rail said. The one you bit. The pathogen is mobile. I can already see it spreading. I need to know how to stop it. And I think you need something from me too. Or you would have triggered your signal organs the moment we had you in the chains. He waited. Then one of the vertical ridges along the creature's jaw, the third one from the left, pulsed differently. A longer beat. An interval instead of a rhythm. Rail sat very still. Fen came in around 10 with coffee he'd made in Rail's kitchen and stood at the workbench and didn't say anything for a while. He'd cracked 2 ribs, which Sarah had taped, and he was moving with the careful economy of a man whose body was sending clear messages about what was and wasn't negotiable. He drank his coffee and watched Rail watch the creature. Cole wants to know if we're letting it go, Fen said. Cole's going to have to wait. Marcus is worse. I know. I need more time. How much more time does Marcus have? Rail didn't answer. Fen sat on an overturned bucket and drank his coffee. In the corner of the barn, the creature's ridges pulsed in their strange syncopated code. And Rail kept his eyes on the third one from the left and listened to the pattern, with the part of his brain that had been listening to dead radio frequencies for a decade and a half. He'd been right about the signal. He'd known he was right the moment he'd felt the creature's initial broadcast, like a fist behind his eyes. A pulse that went to a receiver somewhere above the cloud cover, somewhere in the dark outside the atmosphere, ping that meant found him, or possibly trap, or possibly we're inside. He'd known about the signal organ because he had a scar on his own abdomen from where they'd implanted something similar and then removed it. Not removed cleanly, removed in a way that left the surrounding tissue changed, sensitized, a bruise that never fully healed but that turned out to be an unexpected gift. He could feel their broadcasts, not interpret them exactly, feel them the way you feel a sound that's too low to hear. When the third ridge started its longer pulse, Rail began to understand that the creature was not trying to contact its ship. It was trying to contact him. He pulled the stool closer. The signal came in layers. He couldn't decode it the way you decode language. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was more like pressure, like standing in a room where the air had been replaced with meaning. Images that weren't quite images, impressions, feeling of being observed from a very great height over a very long period of time. The feeling of catalog, of classification, of a species examined the way a naturalist examines a specimen, not with cruelty exactly, but with the total absence of the mercy that comes from recognizing something as your equal. They had been watching human beings for a long time. That much came through clearly. And what they had not understood, what 15 years of observation and experimentation had failed to adequately explain, was the thing that happened when humans were broken. Most species, when damaged beyond a certain threshold, stopped, adapted, found a new equilibrium, ceased forward motion in the direction of the thing that had damaged them. Humans didn't stop. Rael thought about Marcus Dole, who had spent 15 years hunting. He thought about Cole and his chain and the 7 bear traps they'd apparently laid in the woods over a period of months. He thought about Fenn, who'd had a wife and 2 kids in a lumber supply business and had apparently driven out here anyway because Cody called and said, "We got one," and that was enough. He thought about himself. The radio on the kitchen counter, the backup generator, the blackout curtains, the 15 years of not quite letting himself rest, because something in him had always known the pause. Temporary. He thought about Jonah Marsh. The creature's ridge pulsed. Rael looked at it for a long time. "You couldn't figure it out," he said. "Will we keep going?" The amber clusters shifted in the light. "You broke us," he said. "All of us. And we just kept." He paused. "That's what you've been studying. That's what the abductions were about. You're not interested in our biology, interested in the part of us that doesn't know when to quit." He wasn't sure if the creature understood him in any linguistic sense. He didn't think it mattered. He thought they understood each other on the level that counted. "Here's what I need," he said. "My friend, the one you infected. You can reverse the pathogen. I know you can. Your whole experimental model falls apart if you can't. The sample set has to be recoverable for reuse, so you're going to show me how." He paused. "And in return, I'm going to tell you something that might save your people a lot of effort. Whatever you're planning, whatever the buildup is in the last 3 months, it won't work the way you think. Not because we're stronger than you. I don't know if we're stronger than you. But because we have an absolutely catastrophic inability to accept outcomes." He leaned back on the stool. "You could level this planet, and we'd start building in the rubble. Every one of us you break just makes 2 more like us. You've been running the experiment for 15 years, and you still don't have a model that accounts for it, do you?" The ridge pulsed. Slowly, the creature turned its forearm over, a movement that required it to rotate its joint in a direction that Rael's anatomy could not fully process, and displayed the inner surface. There were structures there. Nodules beneath the gray skin, arrayed in a pattern that suggested glands or organs. One of them, near the wrist, was different from the others. Darker, more prominent, pulsing faintly in the same rhythm as the jaw ridges. Rael looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the industrial tubing from the workbench. "I'm going to need your cooperation for this," he said. "And I want you to know something. When this is over, when Marcus is stable and the others are safe, I'm going to let you go." He met the amber clusters head on. "Not because you deserve it. You don't. Jonah's been in the ground for 15 years, and you don't deserve anything from me. I'm doing it because if you go back to whatever you came from and you tell them what you found, that we know you're coming, that we've been watching back, that every man and woman you've broken is still out here running their own private version of a 15-year hunt, maybe you'll reconsider whatever you've got planned." He exhaled. "And maybe you won't, but I need to try." He moved to the creature's side and pressed 2 fingers carefully over the nodule near the wrist. The creature held completely still. Rael took a breath and began to work. He worked for 2 hours. He worked without hurrying, which was harder than it sounds when the thing you're working on is a creature that could kill you 6 ways and has already killed someone you loved and is currently chained to your barn floor with its alien biology on full display. The trick, the thing Rael had learned in 15 years of systems architecture, was to treat fear like noise in a signal. You couldn't remove it. You could filter it. You kept your hands moving and your eyes on the task, and you let the fear run in the background like a process you'd acknowledged and set to low priority. The creature's cooperation was grudging and absolute at the same time. It did not help him in any way that felt voluntary. It simply held still. But holding still, given what it could have done otherwise, was a form of consent that Rael decided to treat as partnership, because the alternative was a paralysis he couldn't afford. The gland near the wrist was a reservoir. He understood that within the first 20 minutes, the structure was too regular, too contained, anything other than storage. The nodule contained something that wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite gel, a compound that moved with slow viscosity. When he made a small incision with the blade he'd sterilized in rubbing alcohol from the first aid kit, he drew it into the industrial tubing he'd cleaned as well as he could, and then stood there with a tube full of alien biology and tried to think like Sarah would think. She would think, what is this supposed to do, and for whom? She would think, delivery mechanism concentration counteragent ratio. She would think, we don't have any of the analytical equipment this properly requires, so we're going to have to be empirical about it, which means careful and slow and watching closely for what happens. He took the tube to the house. Sarah was with Marcus in the living room. She'd set up a makeshift field station on the coffee table, the medical kit open, her laptop running what looked like veterinary pharmacology references on one screen, and a basic chemistry reference on the other. She'd pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and had a magnifying lamp positioned over Marcus's forearm. And when Rael came in, she looked at the tube and then at him with the specific expression of someone who has decided to trust a process they don't fully understand because the alternative is watching a man die on their couch. Tell me everything, she said. He told her everything. She listened and typed notes and asked 3 questions, all of them precise and practical, and then she spent 40 minutes cross-referencing the compound's visible properties against what the toxicology literature said about biological infectious agents and their counteragents, looking for analogs, looking for anything that gave her a framework to work from. It wasn't a framework. It was educated inference and pattern matching, and the kind of clinical intuition that comes from years of treating patients who can't tell you where it hurts. Concentration matters, she said finally. I don't know the right concentration, but I know it matters. We start low and we observe. Okay, and we document everything. Whatever happens, good or bad, we document it. Because we're going to need this information again. Rael looked at her. You're already thinking about next time. I'm always thinking about next time, she said. It's how you survive this kind of work. Cole came in from the kitchen with a cup of coffee he'd made in the French press and stood in the doorway, watching. He was still angry. Rael could feel it coming off him, that particular tight anger of a man who has been told that the revenge he's been carrying for 15 years doesn't get to happen tonight. But he was also watching Sarah work with an expression that was incrementally softening. Competence did that to people. You could be furious at a situation and still recognize that the person managing it knew what they were doing. She always like this? Cole asked quietly. Yeah, Rael said. You did okay, Cole said, which, from Cole, was approximately a standing ovation. Getting Marcus stable took until 3 in the morning. Sarah did most of the technical work, the application of the extracted compound, the monitoring, the quiet clinical competence that had kept large animals alive through rural Montana winters, and now turned itself to something completely outside any veterinary curriculum. She didn't ask too many questions. Which is the dark web of infection at Marcus's forearm, and she applied what Rael told her to apply where he told her to apply it, and she sat beside the couch where Marcus lay shivering and counted his respirations and reported the numbers in a steady voice. By 2:30, the dark lines were receding. By 3, the translucency at the wound edges had cleared. Marcus was running a tough fever that had peaked and broken, and his breathing had evened out into something sustainable. And Sarah finally put down the kit and sat back in the armchair with her eyes closed and hands in her lap. Rael sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets and a glass of water he hadn't drunk. Cole was asleep on the couch opposite Marcus. Fenn sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around his coffee mug and didn't say anything for a long time. What are you going to do with it? Fen finally asked. Let it go, like I said. A silence. Cole's not going to like that. Cole's going to have to live with it. Jonah is dead, Rail said. Killing that thing doesn't bring him back. It never would have. You know that. Fen looked at his hands. Yeah, he said. I know that. And another silence. Doesn't mean I don't want it. I know. Marcus almost died tonight. I know. And you think your plan, telling it whatever you told it, sending it back with a message, you think that works? Rail looked at the window. The sky outside was the deep blue that comes just before the first gray hint of dawn, that hour when the night has said everything it has to say and the day hasn't found its voice yet. No, he said. I don't think it works. I think there's maybe a 20% chance it shifts their calculus enough to buy us some time. I think there's a 70% chance they come back harder because we spooked them. He drank his water. But I've been working in systems long enough to know that the only move you make when you're outgunned is to change the game. They came here expecting to run an experiment. They're leaving with a variable they didn't account for. That's something. That's not much, Fen said. No, Rail agreed, it's not. He went back to the barn at 4 in the morning. The creature was where he'd left it, chained slack because Rail had given it room to move after the procedure. And it had used that room to stand. It stood with its joints at all their wrong angles, and its amber clusters tracking him as he came in, and Rail walked to the chain anchors and began unlocking them methodically, link by link. I'm going to open the north door, he said, locking the locks. The tree line is 300 meters. I don't know how you contact your ship, but I'm assuming you don't need a cell tower. The last chain fell away. The creature stood free in the middle of the concrete floor and looked at him, did what Rail had come to interpret as looking. The amber clusters had a way of holding him that felt like attention, like weight. One more thing, Rail said. He reached into his jacket pocket and put something on the workbench. It was a small circuit board, hand-soldered, the compact antenna, and a battery pack the size of a matchbox. I built this from the frequency I've been monitoring. Prompt broadcast on the same band your signal organs use. He tapped it with one finger. I'm going to keep building them, and I'm going to give them to every person who's had contact with your kind that I can find. A lot of us are out here. More than you think. Every one of them is going to be listening. He stepped back from the workbench. Go home. Think about what I told you. Think about what you've found here, and whether the experiment is worth continuing. He crossed to the north door and pulled the bolts and opened it. Pre-dawn air came in cold and smelling of pine and frost, and the particular stillness that falls over the Montana wilderness in the dead hours. 300 meters of open ground, then the dark wall of the tree line. The creature walked past him through the door. It moved differently without the chains. Smoother, that extra joint finding its natural expression. And Rail watched it cross the open ground with a long stride that was alien in every mechanical particular, and yet somehow, in its forward direction, its purposefulness, reminded him of something stubbornly human. It reached the tree line and didn't look back. Rail still stood in the open barn door and listened. 20 seconds there was nothing. Then the deadband frequency he'd been monitoring for 15 years went briefly, brilliantly, deafeningly alive, a full carrier signal that pressed against the altered tissue along his abdomen like a warm hand. And then it cut to silence, and a minute later the sky above the tree line lit up briefly in a color that had no name in any human language, and then it was dark again. He stood there until the cold got serious. Then he went back inside. Marcus was sitting up on the couch when Rail came back through the front door, which meant either he was better or he was stubborn. Rail suspected both. His forearm was wrapped in gauze, and he had the look of a man who had been told he shouldn't be sitting up and had made a considered decision to do it anyway. You let it go, said. Yeah. Cole's going to lose his mind. Cole can get in line. Rail sat down in the armchair across from him. How do you feel? Like I almost died. Marcus flexed his wrapped hand, testing. Better than I did. Your woman does good work. She does. You going to tell her everything. Rail thought about Sarah, asleep in their bed now, having spent 4 hours keeping a man alive using instructions she'd received from her boyfriend and a compound extracted from an alien in the equipment barn. He thought about the patience she'd built, the space she kept, the way she never pushed at the edges of what he hadn't said. He thought that maybe she was owed the full shape of the thing, now that the shape was a little clearer. "Yeah," he said. "I think I have to." Nodded. He looked at his forearm. 15 years, he said. "I thought when this happened, if it happened, when we caught one, I thought I'd feel better. Or worse, something clean." He shook his head. "I just feel tired. That's probably the fever." "Probably." A pause. "You think your plan works? What you told it?" "I think it's a variable they hadn't planned on. I think it maybe buys time." Rail leaned back. "You know what they were studying? What the whole thing was about." "What?" "What we do when they break us." Chris looked at him. "They couldn't figure out why we don't stop," Rail said. "Why getting hurt just makes us dig in harder. It's like 15 years of watching four men run a one-way vendetta against something that could flash cook them from orbit might have actually, I don't know, given them something to think about." Marcus was quiet for a while. "Jonah," he said finally. "Just the name." "Yeah." He'd have thought this was hilarious. A plan that works because we're too stupid to know when we're beaten. "We're not stupid," Rail said. "We're human. There's a difference. Is there? Ask me in 20 years. Marcus laughed. Actually laughed, the short, cracked sound of a man who hadn't done it in a while. Then he winced and pressed his ribs and said several things that didn't need to be written down. Dawn came in through the window in a long, flat bar of light and found them there. Two damaged, middle-aged men on opposite sides of a living room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. And the quiet that comes after something has shifted. Not resolved, not finished, but shifted. The way text plates shift, grinding against each other in the dark until the surface above them is different." Rail made breakfast. He wasn't a particularly good cook, but he was methodical. He always stood in for talent in the other areas of his life. Eggs, toast, coffee, strong enough to stand in for a threat. Cole woke up from the couch and ate without asking questions, which was unusual for Cole, and suggested he'd heard more than he'd been letting on. Fen ate standing at the counter with his ribs taped and didn't complain once. While he cooked, thought about the creature walking into the tree line. He thought about the long stride, the wrongness of the joints, the way it had moved like a thing that knew exactly where it was going. He thought about the signal that had lit up the dead band like a flare. Not the faint harmonic he'd been parsing for 15 years, but the full carrier, a complete transmission, something being reported and received. He didn't know what had been reported. He didn't know what the creatures would do with it. He knew only what he'd said, and that it was true, and that the truth of it either mattered or it didn't. He thought about Jonah Marsh. Jonah had been the one among them who talked too much and laughed at the wrong moments, and once kept all of them from making a very bad decision by making an even worse joke at exactly the right time. He'd been 16 and dying, and he'd made a joke about how his mother was going to be furious because he'd borrowed her good flashlight. And now he'd lost it out there in the dark. And she was absolutely going to kill him. She'd said, "Not that flashlight, Jonah," and now look. And he was sorry about the flashlight. He really was. Rail had been holding his hand. He hadn't said anything. There wasn't anything to say. What you did instead, what Rail had spent 15 years doing, was carry it forward. Not heroically, just forward. One more day, one more thing built that hadn't been there before. The eggs on plates and the plates on the table, and sat down. Sarah came downstairs in yesterday's clothes and looked at the four of them at the kitchen table and said, "There's something you need to tell me." And Rail said, "Yes." And that was the beginning of a very long conversation. He showed her the circuit board first. Then he showed her the radio. He explained the frequency, the scarring, 15 years of intermittent signal. He told her about Jonah Marsh in a clean, straightforward way that said, "This is not something I'm over, but it's something I can say out loud," which was further than he'd gotten before. He told her about the creature's experimental model, the pathogen and cure cycle, what he'd worked out in the barn while everyone was in the house. He told her what he'd said when he let it go. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, without performing reactions. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and was quiet for a moment. "The signal broadcasts," she said, "the frequency you've been monitoring." "Yeah." You said you're going to give the receivers to other people who've had contact. As many as I can find. There are databases, support groups, technically, though most of the people in them would rather not call them that. Abductees. People who came back different. He looked at his hands. There are more than the official numbers would suggest. How do you find them? Same way I found my own signal. You learn what to listen for. Sarah looked at the circuit board on the table between them. Something was moving behind her eyes, a consideration, a calculation. I could help with that, she said. The outreach. I know people who've had experiences they don't talk about. She paused. This county has more of that than you'd think. Rail looked at her. I'm a large animal vet in rural Montana, she said. Half my clients have stories. I just never had context for them. She met his eyes. I have context now. He didn't say anything for a moment, then he said, there's a risk in being part of this. I'm already part of it, she said. I spent last night keeping your friend alive with alien biochemistry. I think the ship sailed on plausible deniability. Across the table, Marcus made a sound that was approximately a laugh. Okay, Rail said. Okay, she agreed. The sun was fully up by the time Cole and Fenn and Marcus loaded into the pickup. Marcus's arm was wrapped, and his color was better, and he moved like a man who'd made a decision about something. Though Rail didn't ask what it was. Cole shook Rail's hand, without quite meeting his eyes, which was the closest Cole got to an apology. Fenn hugged him briefly and carefully because of the ribs, and then stood back and looked at him. You think we're going to see them again? Fenn said. Yes. Soon? I don't know. Soon enough. Then what's the plan when they come back? Rail thought about the 20%, thought about the other 80, thought about 4 men with bear traps, and a length of chain and 15 years of stubborn, pointless, entirely characteristic refusal to accept the shape of the situation they'd been handed. Same plan we've always had, he said. We don't stop. Fenn nodded, slowly. Then he climbed into the truck. Rail watched them go until the pickup disappeared around the bend in the logging road and the sound of the engine faded. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that looks like someone cleaned the sky overnight. He could smell pine and frost and the residual diesel from the truck. A hawk moved in a long, slow circle above the tree line. He went inside and found Sarah at the kitchen table with the circuit board and a notepad, already writing something down. She had neat handwriting that she used almost exclusively for medical notes and grocery lists, and was now, apparently, applying to a list of people she thought might need to hear what she'd heard this morning. He sat down across from her. The signal, she said, without looking up. When they broadcast, you said you feel it in the scar tissue. Yeah. And the thing you put in the creature, the extraction, you said it was from a gland near the wrist. You also said they implanted something in you. In my abdomen, yeah. Is it still there? He hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms. He'd always thought about the scarring as residue. Something left behind by removal. Like an archaeological site after the dig. Sarah asked it with the specificity of someone who knew what questions to ask about tissue and biology. And the answer, when he sat with it, was not straightforwardly, yes, they removed it. I don't know, he said honestly. She looked up at him. Then I think we should find out. Why? She put her pen down. Because if any part of that implant is still functional, even partially, and if the frequency you can feel corresponds to the same signal band, then you're not just listening to them, Rail. You've been connected to their network for 15 years. She paused. That's not a vulnerability, that's an asset. He sat with that for a moment. The idea had shape to it, the clear, uncomfortable shape of something that had been true for a long time without his knowing it. He thought about the radio. He thought about the 15 years of deadband monitoring. The slow, patient accumulation of data he'd never been sure how to use. He thought about the moment in the barn when the creature's third ridge had shifted into a longer pulse, and something had passed between them, on a frequency that wasn't language, and wasn't silence but something in between, something that had the quality of recognition. You've been connected to their network for 15 years. Okay, he said. You're right. I usually am, she said, and went back to her list. Outside, the hawk made another pass over the tree line. The deadband radio on the counter sat in its usual silence. It was the silence of something waiting. You know this gets bigger, he said. If we build this out, the network, the transceivers, finding the others, it gets a lot bigger and a lot more complicated. And there are people who will want to use it in ways that aren't careful. I know, she said. And we're 2 people with a converted farmhouse and a circuit board. 3 people, Marcus said. He was still in the truck, apparently, because his voice came through the window that Rail had left cracked. I never actually left. I've just been sitting in the driveway deciding something. A pause. I'm in. Whatever this becomes, I'm in. Fenn's voice, more distant. Cole's in too. He says he's not, but he is. Cole's voice, very distant, through 2 sets of glass. I'm absolutely not in. Rail looked at Sarah. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and made her peace with it before it arrived. Okay, he said. Okay. Shh. He picked up the circuit board and turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the hand-soldered connections and the compact battery and the antenna that sang on a frequency most humans couldn't hear. He thought about what the creature had communicated in the barn. Not in language. Never in language, but in the layered pressure of something that was trying to explain a 15-year puzzle. He thought about what it had felt when it felt the answer. Not triumph. Not victory. Something quieter. Quality of an equation that suddenly balances. He thought about Jonah Marsh. He thought about the way grief works. How it doesn't ever go away. Just becomes load-bearing. Part of the structure you build your life on top of. He'd been building on top of Jonah's absence for 15 years, and the structure had held, and he thought it would hold a while longer. Long enough for whatever was coming. He set the circuit board back on the table. First thing, he said, we need to figure out what's still in my abdomen. Second thing, Sarah said, picking up her pen, we need a place to work that isn't the equipment barn. Third thing, Marcus said through the window, someone needs to make more coffee, because it's cold out here and this decision has apparently left me sitting in a truck in your driveway. Rail got up and started the coffee. He moved around his kitchen in the morning light with the careful economy of a man who has spent 15 years arranging his life around a wound he never expected to use for anything. And for the first time in a long time, the arrangement felt like preparation rather than just habit. The blackout curtains on the windows, the backup generator, the radio on the counter, the circuit board on the table. The woman with her notepad and her list of people who had stories they'd never had context for. Outside, who had spent 15 years running a one-way vendetta against something that could reach them from orbit, and had done it, anyway, stubbornly, pointlessly, characteristically, which turned out to be the same thing as purposefully if you had the right frame for it. He thought about the creatures. Not the one that had walked into the tree line, but the ones it was reporting to. He tried to imagine what it would tell them. He tried to imagine what that would mean to a species that had spent 15 years treating humanity as a controlled variable in a contained experiment. Something that had calculated human responses and human limits, with the assumption that limits existed, that there was a threshold past which a species stopped. He hoped the report gave them pause. He hoped the pause was long enough. He hoped it didn't need to be. Outside, the hawk completed its circle and landed in the pines at the tree line edge. Dead band radio on the counter breathed its white static into the quiet kitchen. The Montana morning held itself clear and cold and open. Somewhere above the cloud cover, something had turned away, or turned toward. It wasn't clear yet which one. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was always going to be the point. Fundamental, irreducible fact of what it meant to be the species that kept going, even when the math said stop. Not knowing how it ended. Doing it anyway. Rail poured the coffee. He heard the truck door open in the driveway, and Marcus's boots on the gravel, coming in from the cold. He had work to do.